My name is Carlos Ramirez. I grew up in the small town of El Porvenir in southern Mexico. Life there was never easy, but there was no shortage of dreams either. Big dreams like crossing the border into the United States, where everything seemed possible. Safety, a better future. The possibility of being more than the place where I was born allowed me. From a young age, I learned to value what the countryside gave me. The smell of wet earth after the rain, the sound of the wind in the trees and the heat of the afternoon sun that never seemed to want to go out. But he also knew the harshness of life. My father worked as a mechanic, and my mother, a seamstress, spent long hours at home sewing pieces for the neighborhood. The work was hard and the days were getting longer, but hope was always there, in plain sight, fueled by reports from those who had crossed the border. For them, the dream was ahead. It was enough to take the right step. I wanted to be one of them. I always remember the feeling of being in front of something that seemed unattainable, as if it was within reach of a hand, but never enough to catch it. From a very young age, I saw many neighbors try to cross and they did not succeed. I saw the tired looks and calloused hands of those who returned, their dreams torn apart by the pain of reality. But that never stopped me from dreaming, to believe that perhaps my moment would be different. At the age of 22, I finally felt it was my time. I managed to save enough money to attempt the crossing. It was a mixture of fear and hope. Fear of the unknown, of the pain that I knew would come, but hope that in the end it would all be worth it. My heart was pounding fast whenever I thought about what was coming, but I knew I had no choice. Life as I knew it was stagnant. The only thing that moved me was the idea of a new beginning. Little by little, I approached the border, along with a group of other immigrants. There was a piercing chill in the air, a tension that made each step heavier than the last. The smell of dry land mixed with fear, the cold sweat that ran down my back, reminding me every second of the risk I was taking. When I finally saw the fence, I got a lump in my throat. It seemed infinite, a wall of metal and wire separating my life from a future that seemed within reach of a distant dream. We had to wait for night to fall to cross. The sound of the night, with the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle wind, seemed even louder than my own heart, which was beating so hard that I could hardly hear anything else. The tension in the air was palpable. Each of us felt the enormous pressure of being on the verge of crossing the line that separated the promises of a better future from the brutal reality we knew. No one said much, but the looks between us said it all. We all shared the same dream. We were all willing to pay the price for it. The journey was more difficult than I imagined. The terrain was rough and dark. The shadows seemed to swallow every step we took. Every snap of a branch under my feet caused my body to contract in tension, as if the slightest mistake could cost me everything. Fear was there, like an invisible companion, chasing our group. Even so, the desire to reach the other side was stronger. The noise of the fence being cut made my heart race, a mixture of relief and dread, as if we were about to enter a territory where no one knew what awaited us. When we crossed the fence, there was no applause, there was no celebration. I had the weight of knowing that the real battle had only just begun. The silence that enveloped us was deep, broken only by hurried whispers and the sound of boots tearing at the earth. It was as if we were walking on a razor's edge. Every move could be the last. In that moment, I realized that the freedom which I dreamed of for so long was not something guaranteed. He was always within reach, but never quite within our reach. The road to it was arduous, and there was nothing easy about crossing that border. It wasn't just a line on the map. It was a test of endurance, courage, and above all, survival. With every step I took, my body was crying out for rest, but my mind was telling me to keep going, because the alternative was to go back and live the life I feared so much. But then, in the midst of the darkness, something unexpected happened. The distant sound of an engine cut through the silence of the night, and suddenly a bright light appeared and illuminated our path. My heart froze. I knew it was the guards. I knew that at any moment we could be captured, and all the effort would have been in vain. Fear spread like an icy wave. Our bodies stopped, almost as if the simple act of breathing was enough to give us away. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to silence the storm inside me. The light was approaching, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every second seemed to drag on, and I knew we needed to make a quick decision. But which one? Flee or try to hide? I remembered a piece of advice I gave to a friend, still in Mexico, before leaving. Never give up, Carlos. If you fall into their hands, it's the end. Those words resonated in my mind, and my body reacted instinctively. Without thinking, I dragged the others into a small area of bushes and tried to camouflage ourselves as best I could. The sound of the engine was getting closer and closer, and my body was shaking. Darkness seemed to be our only ally. The light passed by us, illuminating the shadows around us, and I held my breath. My chest felt tight, and I could barely contain the panic that stirred inside me. When the light finally cleared and the sound of the engine became distant, a wave of relief enveloped me, but I knew that the real struggle was just beginning. We continued our journey, but fear never left me. Every step we took seemed to be watched, and every noise around us, no matter how innocent, froze us. Sometimes I wondered if I was really looking for a better future, or if I was somehow sinking deeper into darkness. I knew the stakes were high, but deep down, the feeling that there was no turning back gave me the strength to continue. The days began to lengthen in a way I had never experienced before. The desert heat seemed stronger than the sun had ever been, and each step north seemed to consume the last energy I had left. Hunger imprisoned me, thirst burned my throat, and despite being surrounded by others who shared the same struggle, I felt incredibly alone. There was something desolate about the vastness of the desert, something that made everything seem small, insignificant. I remember a specific moment when I could hardly go on anymore. We walked during the day with the feeling that the sun would never set. I wasn't sure where I was on the road, but I felt like I'd gone days without rest, my body exhausted, my feet hurt from the long walk. That's when my eyes started to lose focus, and my vision became blurry. I began to hear the screams of my companions, but everything seemed so far away, as if I was seeing everything from the outside, from another world. "Carlos, don't stop, please." The voice of Javier, one of the men who was with me, brought me back to reality. It almost dragged my body, forcing me to take another step. In an almost insane effort, I managed to get up. But pain, exhaustion, and despair overwhelmed me. I closed my eyes and concentrated. What moved me now was not physical strength, but a desperate desire to continue. I remembered what my father always told me. When you think you can't take it anymore, think about what brought you here. Look back and see everything you've overcome. And that's what I did. I looked back on the arduous road I had already traveled and saw that I could not abandon everything. He had crossed so many limits, overcome so many fears, that returning now was not an option. The only way was to keep going, even if the next step was life-threatening. The journey didn't get any easier, but something inside me changed. With each step, I began to feel that my resistance was no longer coming from my body, but from my mind, from the invisible force that arises when we refuse to give up. I didn't know what awaited me at the end of the journey, but I knew it would be easier to face death than defeat, and I wasn't willing to give up. The days got even longer. The nights in the desert were cold, and the piercing cold seeped into my bones, reminding me that in those extreme conditions, survival was an endurance game between body and mind. Food shortages became increasingly distressing. Every crumb we could find was a piece of hope, a small flame in the darkness of uncertainty. During one of these nights, lying in a small improvised tomb to protect us from the wind, I heard a different noise. It was a mixture of hurried footsteps and gasping breaths. My eyes widened. The fear reignited like a flame in my chest. Was it someone from the immigration patrol, or a group of other desperate immigrants? The tension was unbearable. The stars in the sky didn't seem as far away as before. The sky, once so wide and inviting, now seemed like a cold, indifferent prison. Suddenly, one of the men in our group stood up, staring at a figure approaching. Fear spread among us like a fever, but when the figure approached, they were neither soldiers nor patrolmen. He was another immigrant. He was as exhausted as we were, as lost as all of us, but there was something familiar in his eyes. He told us that he was fleeing from an ambush, that he had seen how other comrades were taken away and disappeared into the hands of those who protected that border. Those minutes of conversation, between heavy breaths and the sound of the biting wind, seemed like an eternity. He was as tired as we are, but his story reignited a hard truth. Even after all the suffering, there were still others who were in the same struggle. That night, between the sounds of the desert and the words of a stranger, I understood something profound. The journey wasn't just for me, it was all about us. And as much as he struggled, he was not alone. The dawn of that morning was one of the calmest I have ever experienced in my life. The pain in the bodies, the tiredness in the eyes, but also the realization that with each day we spent alive, we were closer to our goal. But at the same time, more distant than we imagined. There were no guarantees. With every step I took, I asked myself, will I make it? But what really gave me the strength to keep going was the hope that in the end, this suffering would have a purpose. And as much as death was a constant risk, it never became the only option. I knew that sleep was within my grasp, and I couldn't let the pain stop me from getting there. As we moved forward, the reality of the American border began to materialize before our eyes. It was no longer about the physical territory we were traversing, but about what it represented. The line separating the two worlds seemed more symbolic than ever, a line that, try as we might, continued to test us in ways I couldn't anticipate. Fear, which once seemed to be an external monster, has now become a part of us. But even so, every step I took was one more step towards my dream, the promise of a new life. Crossing the border without being captured was a daily battle. Every trace left on the road, every noise of a patrol made us think that all was lost. But the group became stronger, perhaps because of shared despair, perhaps because pain, hunger, and fatigue made us closer, more united. We had a common goal, and that made the trip seem somewhat less lonely. That's when we finally approached the last barrier, a small town on the American side of the border. Euphoria took hold of me, but at the same time, a shadow of uncertainty fell over everyone. We knew we were close, but we didn't know if we could get through without getting caught. However, it was precisely there, a few kilometers from the security line, that we were caught. Suddenly, the immigration patrol appeared, illuminating the road with its headlights as if fate had thrown a last stone at us. My heart raced. The fear, that emotion that had accompanied me all along, now seemed paralyzing. We tried to run, but we were running out of strength. Some of the group fell, others were immediately surrounded. I tried to hide, to camouflage myself in the dark, as I had done before. But this time, something was different. They were closer. When I found myself in front of the agents, there was no resistance. Desperation no longer had the strength to make me fight. I tried to speak, I tried to explain, but all I could feel was the weight of reality. The dream he was pursuing had come to an abrupt end. What happened next was a mix of feelings that I could never have imagined. At first, the capture was a hard blow. My body was still shaking from the adrenaline of evasion and uncertainty. They led us in silence, as if we were shadows without identity, without history. I felt the coldness of his hands on my shoulders, dragging me to a place that seemed to be the end of everything I had dreamed of. The fear of being sent back to Mexico, to the life I had left behind, consumed me. We were in a detention center, a concrete and metal cage. The walls were cold, and the atmosphere was permeated with despair. For a moment, I felt that the whole journey was nothing more than a mistake that had led me to this cold and impersonal place. The words of the man next to me, another immigrant who had also been arrested, echoed in my mind. Freedom is expensive, brother. But what is more difficult is not to try. Time passed slowly. Sometimes I wondered if I had really made the right decision. So many nights of silent walks, so many hours under the relentless sun, only to end up stuck again. But in the midst of the pain, something inside me resisted, the feeling that the fight was not over. I couldn't give up now. A few days later, I was called for an interview. My body was tired, but my mind was alert. The woman who interviewed me seemed to have an impassive expression, but there was something in her eyes that made me believe that she was not there to destroy me. He asked the usual questions about my origin, the reason for my flight, my journey there. I answered everything with the honesty I had left, without expecting anything. I knew that if I was deported, it would be the end. But I also knew that if I had a chance to be heard, I had to hold on to her with everything I had. The wait after the interview was endless. The days passed like weeks. I didn't know if the rumors about the asylum process were true or if it was just wishful thinking, but I clung to that illusion, a piece of hope that kept me alive, that kept me moving. Finally, the day has arrived. When they called my name, my heart raced again. They led me to a small room where an officer was waiting for me. He looked at me, then at the papers on the table, and simply said, "You have the right to an asylum hearing. Your story will be heard." The feeling of having a renewed opportunity invaded me. It wasn't the final victory, but it was the promise that perhaps sacrifice had meant something. I knew that the road would still be arduous, that the battles would not be won. But for the first time since I crossed that border, I felt that there was still the possibility of a different future. The asylum process was not easy. Weeks turned into months, and each passing day seemed like an eternity. The feeling of being in limbo, between hope and uncertainty, has become a constant. The detention center, with its metal doors and security cameras, has never ceased to be a reminder of the fragility of freedom. With each visit from the lawyers, with each new form filled out, the weight of waiting consumed me. He knew that he could be deported at any moment, that all the effort to cross the border, to resist the desert and the guards, could have been in vain. During this time, I had long and deep conversations with the other immigrants around me. Many of them, like me, were there in search of a better future, fleeing situations of violence and poverty. But at the same time, they were trapped in a system that saw them as numbers, as statistics. No one there seemed to be treated as a person with a history, with a life that deserved to be respected. This made me reflect even more on everything I had experienced until then. One day, one of my fellow prisoners, a man named Luis, told me a story that stuck in my memory. He spoke of his childhood in El Salvador, of how war and violence had destroyed his family and his city. "I wasn't running away just to survive," he said. "I was fleeing to try to live again, trying to give my children an opportunity that I never had." His words touched me deeply. I was also looking for an opportunity, not just for me, but for everyone who was left behind. The struggle was not only mine, it belonged to all of us. Finally, after months of uncertainty, the day of the asylum hearing arrived. I was nervous but also determined. The courtroom was cold, impersonal, but my voice did not tremble. I spoke with the strength I still had. I spoke of my life, of my escape, and of what it meant to have a future. The judge listened intently, and the silence during the proceedings seemed to absorb my every word. When the hearing was over, they took me out of the room. The time until the final decision seemed like an eternity, a weight that left the heart heavy. But finally the answer came. He had been accepted. I was granted asylum. The feeling of relief was indescribable, not only for the victory, but for the recognition of my history, of my struggle. I would finally have the opportunity to rebuild my life, to live in a country where I could be free, where my voice would be heard. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a new beginning. I left the room with the feeling that, despite all the difficulties and losses, there was something immense that I still carried. The certainty that no matter how arduous, the struggle for a better future was never in vain. The relief of receiving asylum approval was only the beginning of a new chapter, but also the beginning of a process of reintegration into a world that, as welcoming as it was, still seemed strange and distant. When I left the detention center, I couldn't help but reflect on what it really meant to be free. The freedom he sought was not something that could be earned simply with a piece of paper or an official signature. It was something deeper, more complex, something that was rebuilt every day with each new decision. For the first few months after my release, life in the United States felt like an emotional roller coaster. I had to learn how to navigate a new system, understand a new culture, deal with the daily challenges of someone who was, in a way, a stranger even to himself. The words I used in my daily life didn't seem to have the same weight, the same fluidity. The Portuguese he spoke became a foreign language to others, and English, while useful, never sounded completely natural. I still felt homesick, the streets of my city, familiar faces. But at the same time, there was a force in me that was pushing me forward. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was still in front of me, and the opportunity to remake it was a luxury I knew I couldn't waste. What struck me the most when I arrived was the realization that life here went on indifferent to my struggle. People were in their own worlds, not knowing anything about what I had gone through to get there. The immense freedom he had sought seemed in many ways to be an illusion to those who had never had to fight for it. However, I also realized that my story wasn't complete. It would not only be a story of pain and suffering, but of resilience and reconstruction. In the first few months, I did what any immigrant does. I started working to secure the basics, small jobs, often exhausting, but necessary. As a waiter in a busy restaurant, I heard stories and laughter everywhere. But inside, my mind was still in that desert, in those endless nights. The reality of where I was now was hard to comprehend, as if there was still a part of me trapped in a distant place. However, I knew that rebuilding my identity would not be an easy task. It would not be done overnight. The biggest challenge, however, was the nagging fear that at any moment he could lose everything. The fear that someone would know about my origin, my journey, and that they would bring me back to that limbo from which I had come. But I couldn't live in fear forever. The future could only be built if it allowed me to leave the past behind. The courage to start over, to find a new reason to move forward, was what moved me now. Gradually, the pieces of my life began to fall into place. I found new friends, people willing to help me, to show me that being an immigrant did not mean being a permanent stranger. I met others who, like me, were looking for a fresh start, and together we tried, day after day, to shape something that resembled home. I still remember the words of Luis, the man I met in detention: "Freedom is expensive, brother, but what is more difficult is not to try." And that's what I kept doing, trying, every day. The months that followed were in many ways a constant test. Each day felt like an opportunity to take another small step into the future I'd been looking for, but it was also a constant struggle against what I'd left behind. The feeling of always dividing my attention between what I was living and what I was building became familiar. Sometimes I found myself reminiscing about those nights in the desert, the faces of my comrades who had disappeared along the way, and the weight of the decisions I made to get there. But over time, I began to realize that these memories, while painful, were also important parts of who I was now. Working in the restaurant, which at first seemed like a burden, began to give me a sense of stability. It was an environment that allowed me to interact with people from different backgrounds and in a way connect with a community. But the real basis of my new life was education. I signed up for English classes, something I always knew was essential for my adaptation. Learning the language was not easy. The sounds and grammatical structures were often confusing, but as I mastered more and more words, I felt an indescribable inner growth. It wasn't just the language I was learning, but also the ability to communicate with the world in a way that seemed impossible before. Over time, I began to build a new purpose. The fear that had once overwhelmed me, the uncertainty about my permanence, slowly began to dissolve as I realized that I now had something I didn't have before, the opportunity to choose. It was as if, in leaving the desert behind, I had also left behind the fear that had accompanied me for so long. I could now decide what to do with my life, even if it meant starting from scratch. It was also during this period that I met a new friend, an immigrant who, like me, had come to the United States in search of a better life. His name was Ahmed, and he had a story very similar to mine. We talked about the challenges of being an immigrant, about homesickness, and about how the struggle seemed to never end. But at the same time, there was something liberating about knowing that despite everything, we were still walking. Their friendship became an important pillar, someone with whom he could share not only the hardships, but also the small victories. Little by little, I created a support network. Friends, co-workers, teachers who believed in me, all were fundamental for me to find a new meaning in my life. However, a part of me never forgot the purpose that brought me here: to help those who were still in the same situation as me, who were going through the same painful process that I once went through. I wanted to make a difference, even if it was in a small way. And then, one day, after many months of hard work and dedication, I got what once seemed impossible: my own house. It wasn't big, it wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. It had solid walls, a kitchen where I could prepare my own meals, and a small garden where I began to grow plants that, in a way, symbolized my journey. My home was a reflection of all that I had accomplished, a place of refuge, but also of growth and reconstruction. It was proof that despite everything I had been through, I had reached a new chapter in my life. When I finally sat down in my living room looking out the window, I realized that the journey wasn't over yet. I was far from my end goal, but at the same time, I was no longer the same as before. My story, my journey, everything I experienced had transformed me. And perhaps in some ways, it would have also given me something more valuable than any cross-border. The realization that even when all seems lost, a fresh start is always possible. The days took on a new quality after I settled into my house. The routine, which had previously been marked by constant struggle and uncertainty, now had some peace, although still with its own challenges. Mornings were dedicated to work, afternoons to school, and afternoons, often, to reflection on everything that had happened and what was to come. I realized that even with the feeling that I had accomplished something great by having a place to call my own, the adaptation process would never be complete. There was always more to learn, more to face. Fear, for example, was still there, lurking, like a silent shadow. It wasn't a constant fear, but sometimes it arose in the most unexpected situations, like when I went to the bank and felt the tension of not knowing if, looking at my documents, something could go wrong. Or when I saw the news about immigration and wondered if, by some mistake, they could take away my freedom. The society around me seemed more and more different than I imagined, but I was also beginning to understand that this difference was what made my journey unique. The people I spoke with, the small moments of interaction, showed me a diversity that I had never experienced before. At first, everything seemed strange and distant, but over time I learned to see the beauty in differences. The difficulties I encountered, such as the language barrier or cultural adaptation, began to be seen as part of the process. Each new difficulty he overcame was a silent victory. One afternoon, as I was walking through the neighborhood where I now lived, I saw a group of newly arrived immigrants staring blankly as I had once been. They spoke softly, their faces with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as if they were trying to figure out what to do with their new reality. I was overcome by an impulse, a strong desire to reach out and in some way help them. I remembered how alone, lost I felt when I got here, and so I decided to do something I never imagined doing. I went to them, I talked to them, I shared a little bit of my story. I talked about the difficulties I faced and what gave me the strength to continue. I didn't have much to offer beyond my experience, but in that moment, something inside me ignited. It was as if the struggle he had waged was not only to get here, but also to be able to reach those who were still at the beginning of their journey. That seemingly simple moment made me realize something profound. An immigrant's struggle is never lonely, even when it appears to be. In every step we take, there are others who walk beside us, even though they are far away, and it is our responsibility to help light the way for them. The exchange of stories, of experiences, became a way to give a greater purpose to my new life. Time passed and nostalgia, although it never completely disappeared, transformed into something more manageable. I learned to honor my origins without them defining my identity completely. He was an immigrant, yes, but he was also more than that. He was someone who had lived, who had faced immense challenges, but who could now look to the future with cautious optimism. What I learned over the years was that the process of adaptation did not take place in big leaps, but in small daily victories. It was to find every day a new reason to smile, to move forward. It was knowing that, no matter how far away the past was, the present and the future were still within my reach. And so over time, I built a life that, although it was never easy, became deeply mine. With all its difficulties and joys, challenges and overcomings, this life was my story. And I knew that somewhere along that road, my journey, however long and arduous it was, had been worth it. Because in the end, freedom was not something that was conquered once and for all. It was something that was reconquered with each new step. And I was ready to keep walking, Life went on, with its ups and downs like any other. Although the feeling of finally being home was strengthened, a part of me knew that adaptation would never be a totally linear process. The personal victories I achieved, such as a good performance at work, a degree in English, or the simple ability to navigate a big city without getting lost, were accompanied by moments of insecurity, in which memories of the difficult journey I had traveled came back in full force. It was almost as if there were two versions of me, one that I was here, living an ordinary life, and another that carried the weight of a complex and painful past. However, as the years went by, my vision of home began to expand. It was no longer just the small house where I lived or the neighborhood where I worked, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to belong. I didn't have to settle for what other people thought about what I was supposed to be. The simple fact of being there, of having conquered a space, a right, of being respected for what I had overcome, began to give me a sense of belonging that I never imagined I would feel. This does not mean that the path was free of obstacles. From time to time, there were still moments of doubt. At times, I wondered if my journey there had been accepted by everyone around me. But gradually, I understood that the expectations of others should not be the standard by which I would measure my happiness or my success. He had charted a path for me, and it was unique. The biggest challenge, however, was dealing with the distance from my country. Sometimes when I talked to my family on the phone, I felt an immense longing, a void that I couldn't fill here. They were still there, living their lives, with their own battles, and I was somehow living another reality now. But at the same time, I allowed myself to understand that this distance did not mean abandonment or oblivion. It was, in fact, an expansion of my being, a reinvention of my roots. I think that's what happens to a lot of immigrants. You start to understand that your home isn't just one place. It is, in fact, a set of experiences, feelings, memories, which can be spread across different parts of the world. It is not a fixed point, but an idea in constant movement. Life continues to unfold before me, and while I've lived long enough to know that hardship will never fully cease, I've also learned that resilience isn't just about enduring challenges. It's about learning from them. Every obstacle I faced, every twist and turn on my path, taught me something vital about who I am and what I am capable of achieving. More importantly, I realized that what motivated me now was not just the pursuit of a better life for myself, but the hope that I could help others. There was something deep in me that I knew that for the immigrant, for those who were just beginning their journeys, my story could be more than an example. It could be a symbol that although the road is arduous and full of uncertainties, it is possible to create a new beginning. As my time in the United States stretched, and I settled more and more into my new life, I knew that true freedom was not just physical, but emotional and psychological. It was the freedom to be who I chose to be, to look to the future without fear, knowing that despite all the difficulties, my voice, my story, and my existence were valid. The journey I traveled was not just a matter of geography. It was a journey of the soul. And even though the future was unknown, I knew that with every step I took, I would be closer to becoming the person I always wanted to be. Time, as always, has passed, with its unique ability to make everything more distant and at the same time more present. When I look back, I realize that the person I am today is a synthesis of everything I have experienced. Those experiences, which once seemed fragmented and painful, now fit together in a way that forms a coherent story, a story of overcoming and reinventing oneself. The funniest thing is that, throughout the process, I realized that the simplest things, those that once seemed insignificant, became the greatest achievements. Sometimes it's the smile of a stranger in a supermarket, or the relaxed conversation with someone at work, that makes you realize how far you've come. It's these moments of human connection, small but profound, that prove that you're no longer the one who arrived here years ago, with nothing but a dream and a backpack full of hope. Throughout these years, I realized that my identity was no longer tied only to the past. He was, yes, an immigrant, but he was also something more, someone who, despite all the adversities, was present in the lives of others. I began to help in the local community, sharing my experience with those who were beginning the journey I once took. I saw people who, like me, were scared, alone, and I felt an urgent need to give them the hope that, deep down, I knew was in me. Helping others was not only a way to make sense of what I went through, but also a way to fill that void that still existed within me. The nostalgia didn't completely disappear, but it became something I knew how to carry. It was a longing that didn't paralyze me, but that gave me the strength to keep going, to create something new, something that was as much mine as it was all that I met along this journey. And then, in one of those simple moments, a small act of kindness, I realized a fundamental truth. The journey never ends. We cross to find more than just a physical place. We have found the ability to be more, to create something that transcends pain and fear. Freedom is not an endpoint, but a continuum, a journey that challenges us to reinvent ourselves at every turn. And deep down, that's exactly what makes us truly free. The ability to never give up on who we are, even when the world around us tries to define us differently. Today, looking back on my life, I know that what really matters is not how much I've accomplished, but how every bit of this journey has taught me to be resilient, to trust in my own strength. Every day, I strive to be the most authentic version of myself, embracing the struggles, the victories, and most of all, the people who are part of this story. I am no longer the man who fled from an unforgiving reality in search of a better future. I am now the man who has chosen with courage and determination to create that future, not only for himself, but for all who cross his path. And so, I follow him. Because I know that as long as there is a journey ahead, there will always be something new to learn, conquer, and share. And so, with a new look at the world and myself, I continue the journey. An immigrant's journey is long, full of ups and downs, but it's also a story of resilience, growth, and ultimately belonging. What began with the struggle for survival, the search for a future, has now become a life full of meaning and new beginnings. Every challenge I face is an opportunity to reaffirm myself, to build something solid and lasting. And even when difficulties arise, I know that I am stronger than I ever imagined I would be. The journey continues, but now more than ever, I know that true freedom lies in the ability to start over and find beauty in the small victories of everyday life. This is the end of one chapter, but at the same time, the beginning of many others. And with that, I keep going, with my head held high, ready for what is to come, trusting that the fight for a better future is never in vain.